Hello, and welcome to a new installment of At the Podium with me, Patrick Huey. At the Podium is a platform where we will learn from people who come from different walks of life, careers, and experiences, but all share one thing in common. They have stepped fully into the transformative power of saying yes to the unexpected turns of their lives, and they are now using the power of their voice, or podium, to make an impact on our world today. At the Podium is the intersection of art, culture, and big thoughts wrapped up in good, old-fashioned conversation. Today, I am thrilled and humbled to share the podium with Glynis Rigsby. Glynis Rigsby is an assistant professor and BFA program director for the School of Drama at the New School College of Performing Arts in New York City. Her scholarship is in the area of consent culture, and she has presented her work at Pace University, Fordham, and at the Association for Theater and Higher Education Annual Conference. Her artistic practice is in stage direction and includes work at Prototype and Here's Culture Mart with Sunken Cathedral, the Opera Project with The Rape of Lucretia, and the Yale Center for British Art with Britannia Triumphans. As a collaborator, she has devised scripts with screenwriter Dan Pullock, The Rite of the Serpent Skirt, and solo artist Jasmine Ranieri, The Furibunker and the Devil's Mistress, and Jane Ray with Beautiful and Radiant Things. She has directed at Yale College, Fordham, and Yeshiva universities, and served as an artistic associate at the American Conservatory Theater and as chair of acting for film at the New York Film Academy's New York and for the BFA program at its South Beach campus. Glynis received her MFA in directing from the Yale School of Drama. Before we hear from Glynis, I want to invite you to share at the podium with the people in your lives. If you find our conversation today valuable, and I hope you will, take a screenshot and share on your Instagram and tag @thepodium_Patrick Huey. Or if you're on Facebook, share our link there. Your shares, likes, and 5-star written reviews help grow our audience and move us up the charts. I'm grateful for your help in that capacity. Glynis, welcome to At the Podium.
Thank you so much for having me, Patrick.
I am so happy that we are talking today. We have not been together in person almost since the day we graduated from the Yale School of Drama 20 years ago.
I think that's right.
I have two really amazing memories of our time together. The first was that you directed a Harold Pinter play called The Collection, and the play was Jane Cho, who's done an At the Podium, Mark Maddock, Edward O'Blennis, and myself. And it was what was then called our Drama 50, which was one of the first plays that the actors in the first year could be in. And I believe it was your first play that you directed at Yale. And I remember also, I think it was in our second or third year at Yale, you directed Bridget, Flannery, and I in another Harold Pinter play. It was called The Landscape in the Yale Cabaret. And I just remember working with you. I always felt like you wanted me in the parts that I was cast in with you, which at Yale, the directors didn't always have say over who they could or couldn't cast in parts. And so sometimes I may have been the second, third, fourth, fifth choice, but that's sometimes you just end up with. But I always felt like you wanted me in those roles. And it was just a very good feeling to feel that from you. And I always felt that we were collaborators, which I think is part of the genius of your work.
Thanks. I mean, I think I was trying to figure out, it's always when you're telling stories, which is probably what directing is about, the order in which you tell them, or how one event leads to another, and how this process of discovery is made, but I'll wing it. So my mother recently said, looked at me and said, Glynis, you always loved children. You always loved them. And it's not to compare actors to children, but I think the reason she said that is I always loved people. And sometimes adults are a little hard because there's a lot of masking going on and it's hard to access them. But I never had an issue accessing, I thought, children. And I loved them because I felt like I could see souls, I could see spirits inside of them. And so for me, working with actors is, and I think this will jump forward to working with students, is about working with people's spirits and souls. I mean, also you guys were so talented and so extraordinary. I was so grateful to be working with people who had that level of skill and that level of commitment. But I think it's interesting when you're collaborating with somebody, this question of what's the common language.
Yes.
It's like tuning into a radio station. How are you? Where are they and where are you? And sometimes it's not a good collaboration because I'm AM and you're FM and we're just like, we'll do it, but it's rough.
It's interesting that you say that because, and we'll talk about Will Frears later, because I think some of the journeys of your career have mirrored his career, but we were talking about this idea of the common language. It's not that it's groupthink, but you have a common vernacular that allows for the collaboration to happen. I
think it has to do also with the healthy size in terms of ego. Because I think if you don't have any ego, I was just listening to Shannon's podcast. And so it was so fascinating to hear what Shannon had to say about our process and collaboration. But I think when you don't have any ego, it's actually a problem, because sitting in a room and when people ask you your opinion and not having any is actually debilitating in terms of collaboration. You sort of have to hold up your end of the bargain in terms of having ideas and being able to suggest things. But that ego has to be sized well enough and healthfully enough that you can also realize the other person also has a hopefully healthy sized ego. And I think that for me, collaboration runs into problem when ego starts to be oversized.
Agreed.
Because then and I think for me, the biggest issue with that is that when the ego becomes oversized, you're also asking people to essentially be part of your ecosystem, but they're like, that's really where the work is. So what value are they going to have? I mean, they basically support you. There's no higher power. There's no higher cause to that. Whereas if you can work in collaboration, you decide the higher cause together. But if it's not going to work out in a way that works for both of you, collaboration becomes really hard.
I think the ego is very interesting because there is a collaboration. And I think there has to be, I think the egos have to be in any business. I think the egos have to be in check and in line with one another. But at the end of the day, in the rehearsal hall, the director's vision for what the play is, who the characters are, must be set by the director in a play. I think television is very different, where you have directors coming and going and the actors really become the guardians of those characters. In the theater, I think the director has to have, in a sense, the final say. And the final say can be built through collaboration. But if the director isn't fulfilling that role, the power dynamics in the room are off.
It's funny with our origin story as directors, because we come out of the 19th century, which is about 2,500 years later than almost everybody else involved in theater. And yet somehow we're supposed to be the primary lead.
Yes.
And I think that is that relationship comes because, and I like to talk about trends, and like sometimes trends will come and go, but sometimes, like the iPhone, you get something and you will never give it up again. So we are never giving up smartphones. It's not happening. And I think when the director hit, having a human being whose sole responsibility was to make sure that what was going on stage made sense for the audience, that's what I think really vision is. It's a kind of coherency. And once theater figured out that could happen, they were never going to let it go.
Right. You can't unring that bell.
Problem is that coherency got wrapped up in the package of literally a German duke, but very much like white European aristocracy. And so you get a lot of habits out of directors. I mean, in a lot of habits, it's not even that we're taught them, but we just see them in other directors. And this is just my generation of artists. I think it's so beautifully changing. But in my generation, there were a lot of habits that had to do with authoritarianism, that had to do with ego, that had to do with the particularly coming out of, I think, the 80s, the ascension of the I.
Yes.
That could be really problematic. And
Yes.
there was, in my perception, a vast lack of humility. It's as if none of us knew the origin story. We had no idea that writers and actors had been doing this for thousands of years before we'd come to it, and that
Right.
we were the tiniest. We still needed to grow as directors. As a
Right.
practice, we still needed to figure out who we are. And I think we're still doing it, actually.
It's interesting that you say that about the role of the authoritarian directors shifting, because I think as artists become more complete artists, and you see it a lot in Hollywood, where Issa Rae is the actor of her show, but she's also the producer, she's also the writer, she's making directorial decisions, she's making content decisions. I think as we start to expand what the view of creativity looks like and who can create, I think those types of sort of molds that we've all sort of agreed to collectively to play and to be a part of are slowly starting to fray at the edges. I was having a conversation with a former professor of mine, and he asked me, what do you think actors need to learn today? And my response was, actors need to learn to create content. Because if they simply wait for the agent to call, the agent's never going to call. And people want to buy known entities today. So I think the concept of the authoritarian director is starting to shift as how we create is shifting.
It's a really fascinating schism, because what I would say is it is starting to shift among a certain population. And then I sometimes think, I'm just thinking politically and socially, there's a reinvestment in authoritarianism in another direction. And so, because with authoritarianism comes safety, you don't have to be responsible. So if the show's, we'll put it in directing, if the show's terrible, it's the director's fault.
Right.
And that's very comforting, I would imagine. Like, that's kind of a great, it's not my responsibility. If I'm terrible, then, so within collective creativity comes collective responsibility.
Right.
Where we're all responsible.
And people don't like responsibility, at least not right now. We want to point fingers. And it's kind of it's kind of the power of the arts, how it can be a part of society and also be play counterpoint to what's happening in order to reflect back. And so if the creative process has become less authoritarian, more decentralized, more democratic, and our social institutions are moving more towards a sort of singular thought or a singular way of being, it's a very interesting tension that exists between the arts and the culture that it reflects.
What's interesting is I don't know whether we're at that place. It's hard with hindsight. You're looking back on a time maybe you weren't participating in, and it looks so clear from the outside, but I think it probably wasn't. Well, one of the things I realized at some point about classic works of art is that classic works of art were operating with a whole bunch of other works of art. It wasn't like they were only doing, it's like these three plays, or the artwork of these three artists. You only know the work of those three artists because those are the only ones we still care about. But a lot of work was going on, and it's when you're in a time, all of that work is coming at you simultaneously. Sometimes I'll get on Insta and it's a joy, and sometimes it's just I'm scrolling through a lot of detritus.
Oh, I love that word. I love that word.
But I think that's the hardest thing, is to know what has value in your own time, or what will be seen in your own time. Because we also know that there were a bunch of artists, when you actually try to go back through, it's like, well, there weren't any, female composers. Yeah, there were actually a lot of them, like a lot of them. And they were pretty good, to be quite honest.
Yeah.
So that's all. I think that's the funny thing about this time, is we want the clarity that we see in the past sometimes. And
Right.
I think about it a lot when we think about like classical education, which I feel like we sort of came from. Classical education is falsely clear.
It cuts a lot of people out of the narrative, is what you're saying. And it also assumes that, and maybe to agree, it is true that where we are is where we were going to end up, and that everything sort of led to this particular moment in time when we are all doing this dance of the director, the actor, etc. But it doesn't account for someone like a Basquiat or even Van Gogh. And how is art going to even interact with what's happening in social media? Because there are creative artists within that medium, and will their work even be seen? So it's a really interesting question about, because everything is so disposable now. So we delete accounts and we pull our stuff off the internet, and there's no there is a record, but there is no visible record that you can easily find if someone takes down their work. So it's a really interesting concept, dilemma, I suppose.
Well, and the other thing you start finding when you sort of go down the rabbit hole of it is usually by the time someone or an idea surfaces, it's actually been in rotation for quite a while. So it literally has been underwater for quite a while and will sometimes surface.
Right.
And the surface is when we know about it. So we will often name that as its origin point without understanding all of the tenterhooks and education that went into it. The truth is that there's a place where sometimes I feel like my great artistic contribution is to put things in the souls of people who then go out into the world, and whether or not they are the creature that surfaces, or God knows 40 years later, another, they're teaching and talking and interacting, and you're talking about your professor. And it's interesting to think of us being in this chain of creation. So that's the other thing, is it's not a single person that's involved in that creation. It's often, there's a huge chain of creation. And sometimes that chain of creation, okay, I'm going to be chatty now. Some of that chain of creation has to do with things like parents, or my favorite story. There's a story about the 7 bodhisattvas. And in one case, the bodhisattva came to enlightenment by laying on the couch for 30 years. And I just, particularly as a woman and a wife and a mother, was like, who made your meals? Let me tell you who the bodhisattva is.
Who fed you?
And so I think that's the interesting for me social construct that we're coming to, is we're starting to understand that you cannot achieve these things. When we look at the dissolution of Amazon and the fact that Jeff Bezos is going to space.
Time and the future may prove Bezos and Branson right. And we just
don't know.
We don't know.
We don't know.
We could talk for 2 hours about this.
I know.
My second favorite memory of you when we were at school together was your Strindberg scene that you did with Brandon Miller. So for those of you listening, in your first year at the drama school, your first 2 years at the drama school, the actors and the directors are in acting class together so that the directors can learn the technique and ostensibly direct to how we were taught to act and train. And so they perform scenes with all of us as if they're actors. And the first year we study Strindberg, Ibsen, and Chekhov. And so you did a scene with a gentleman, a fantastic actor named Brandon Miller. And I think it was Miss Julie. Was it Miss Julie?
Might have been Miss Julie.
We'll call it Miss Julie just for the sake of time. But at the end of the scene, you walked out of the studio and you slammed the door, and we just hear this guttural, primeval scream. And I just remember sitting there and I was like, Glynis hit it out of the park. It was the perfect, I'll let you tell your perspective on it. I just loved it. I thought it was amazing.
A couple things were true in that room. One of them was that it was the first time I had been an actor who didn't need to be successful at it.
Wow.
And I talk about that a little bit because I actually started to get some attention because of some things that were happening in that room. And I was casting cabaret shows. And the minute I was supposed to be good, all of the traps came slamming. I was basically exactly where you guys were in that room. But in that room, because it was a very precious thing to be told you're here, but actually if you're terrible, that reaches expectations. It's very freeing.
Right.
And I could talk a little bit about how I use that with acting students a lot. This idea that it's like, if I give you this note and you're terrible, that's my fault, to take that responsibility, because it was so freeing for me. Evan told us we were doing Ibsen, and Evan kept catching us and being like, why are you doing the scene that way? And we're like, what are you talking about? And I distinctly remember it was Hedda Gabler versus the Doll's House. There were other plays. And she was like, why are you playing the scenes in the Doll's House as if Nora's losing? And we were like, because she does. And Evan said, read that scene again. A lot of what I learned at Yale was how to read, and how to read without an idea of what was going on, but to look at what was actually going on. And it turns out that one of the things that Ibsen is kind of spectacular at is taking someone, the weak characters will always be winning scenes and the stronger characters will be losing them, because that is dramatic tension and conflict and actually interesting. One of the hardest things for the students I work with now, and for any of us to understand, is to understand how to walk into a scene and actually realize the character has no guarantee for the future. The character is just like us, walking in and being like, even a character who's like, this has got to work. Yes, but there's no guarantee that that's true.
Right.
So we're all in real time. I think that's what she really taught me, is we're all in real time. I'm just flashing to Shannon when Shannon was like, had already had a television directing career and was like, am I going to wait tables? And I was like, oh my God, we're all in real time all the time.
We live in real time. And that's a very frightening, humbling place to be, is in real time.
But if you can let go of the fear of it and you can just be in real time, then what happened on that day was that Strindberg is not necessarily a fan of my gender pretty consistently. The conversation in the scene was extraordinarily frustrating. I felt like my character was really trying to fight for what they needed and had basically been set up to lose, but had lost after a lot of work. Strindberg makes actors, like female characters, go through a lot of work. And so I think what was happening at the time was I walked out of the room, slammed the door, and the slamming of the door, which one would think is enough, I was like, that is not enough. And it was all the frustration that the character had in the scene before. And because it wasn't a showpiece, it wasn't intentional, it was a direct line to everything that had happened in that room in that moment. It might not have happened at any other moment. I think that's where it came from. And I remember, I think distinctly, I was definitely screaming as the character. I mean, there might have been a little bit of the actor in there, but it was just, she was so angry. And there was really no other way to be in it.
It was true. And I think that's why the response was there, that was there from the class watching, is because this is so esoteric, but oftentimes when we are existing within these very sort of historic plays, we struggle to make them relatable in the modern world because we just don't live, we do live under certain circumstances that are similar to that, but the day-to-day of our lives are not reflected in those plays usually. And I think what The Scream did was modernize, drop the play into the moment of the now. And it was this great Brechtian gesture of that entire, probably first year for everybody, where we was like, if I could just slam a door and scream, I'd be okay.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the greatest things about acting, is that if you can get it like in the pocket of it, you can actually live so much more fully, because the plays will allow you to do things and the characters will allow you to do things that you can't do. And so I think that's a little bit of the addiction sometimes to acting. It's just, there are all of the other things. I mean, I think any life choice, you're doing the sort of cost benefit analysis. And I think that what you're talking about a lot of the market in terms of acting, for some, the cost benefit analysis can be too high.
Yeah.
But at its best moment,
yeah,
you're just in it.
So what led you to wanting to be a director?
Oh, that's a great question. I mean, to be completely candid, I was in Southern California. I was not a thin child. And when I say that, I'm being, I was portly. And I knew people in our school who were doing commercial work. So I had a very clear idea about what it would take. But I still wanted to tell the stories, and I still wanted to feel it in my body and be in it. So I think the answer is, I tend to think in big picture. I think that's just the way I think. Mm-hmm. And I think that for me is the mind of a director.
And so we meet at Yale. You have a great 3 years together at Yale, and then you go off to become a pretty successful director. I mean, you're building a career, a very strong career. And we recently had a conversation about your decision to not want to be a director who is every 3 months moving somewhere else to do a different play. And you talk about your decision to step away from that, and you describe it as a moment of grief. Can you talk about that, about what that grief was and how you finally decided that the grief wasn't enough to stop you from making the decision that you made.
Yeah, I think it definitely connects to this idea that I've been doing it since I was 15 years old, that it was something I was taught to care deeply about. I took a gap year, which was unusual, where I tried to do something else. I tried to do children's literature and astronomy and so other things. And I just ended right back into theater because there were always plays about those things. I could actually do all of those things in theater and it was more fun. So I go back to college, I graduate from the University of California, Irvine. I'm a director there. I study acting, but also directing. And I direct plays, and I go to San Francisco and I end up working at the American Conservatory Theater. And at some point I realized I basically needed a springboard. There was no way where I was, it was very lateral. And so and also my boyfriend was going to law school at the time. So I was like, I'm not finding a new apartment in the city. This is crazy. It's time. We're going.
Always the boyfriend.
Oh my God. I thank God, right? Because then I had to actually apply. And I applied to 6 schools and got into some of them. And Yale actually waitlisted me. And when they called and told me I got in a month later, I cried. So I went to Yale, and one of the things about Yale is it's sort of a machine for a certain kind of performance idea. You talked about it as being regional theater, but I think it also, it goes into film and television. But we're told this story about all of the ones who came before us who did it. The implication is did it right, and doing it right meant I was supposed to go off and have. I actually didn't even mean directing for film and television because that's a separate school. It was specifically directing for the stage. It was directing consistently and professionally enough for the stage that you were at a certain level, usually the level of your teachers. And that's how you knew you were good at it. Other people said you were.
Right.
And I would say I was doing okay. In New York, it wasn't bad. But it turned out that the one question, we had this conversation, but the one question they did not ask me when they gave me all of that education and pointed me in that direction was, do you like to freelance? Because I don't like to freelance at all. I like a certain kind of consistency to my day and a certain kind of consistency to the people I work with. And I actually think that the coming together and making a new family and then that family breaking up. And I know we can come together again, we can hire the same people. But I don't think that was particularly good for my soul, it turned out. And also, I just needed a job. I needed a job. But the embedded story inside of that is when I finally decided, when I made the decision, it was because my child was 2-ish, and I was teaching acting and freelance directing, and I basically needed to make more money, and I needed health insurance. Like I had a child who the New York State was being very helpful with, but I knew that child needed and deserved more than I was giving them. And so I made a decision. I think I decided I wanted to be a mom more than, I wanted to be a theater professional, but I also didn't want to be a theater professional at the expense of that. Now there are caveat, like I can name them brilliant directors, particularly women who are directors, who work in New York consistently and have extraordinary careers and also have children. So it was very particular to me, that decision. I also wanted to see my kid. Again, there's workarounds all over the place and other directors have done it. So it was very personal. But once I started to build a job, which was basically a sort of school administrator position, I started to chair and I started to work full time in chair. And I think the grief you're talking about, when I thought about it, when we talked about it and I thought about it, I actually think the grief was an acceptance that I would never be what I thought my parents wanted me to be and what I thought my professors wanted me to be, and what I thought in many ways, like you guys at Yale wanted me to be. Oof. That I was going to need to be myself, and I was going to need to let go of that approval.
Oh, Glynis.
And that hurt a lot.
Glynis.
Yeah.
I think, wow.
Because it's kind of embedded. We went through it together. Like it's embedded, and I always think our journeys are in some ways a little parallel. You went through the same thing. It almost feels like you're saying no, like you were given this immense gift of that education and you're saying no, no, I don't want it. And it takes a lot of years to realize that well, I fundamentally don't agree with someone who says that the education is tied to a specific profession.
It's not. And I think that is part of the challenge of it all, is when you move away from that the myth making of the institution itself says that the success has to be in the particular lane that you have been ascribed to. And then when you step out of that, when you step into the broader fullness of your life and you have to start making decisions about, my child is more important to me than sitting in a tech rehearsal, the validity of what we've learned and what we've done and the successes that we've had outside of that are not less important because we are not within the vocabulary that we talked about earlier of a play or a TV show or a movie.
It does feel a little like you took a golden ticket.
Yeah.
And when you decide that you don't want to use it the way that the institution or the implication was that you would use it, there's a lot, I mean, it's just a tremendous amount of feeling around that.
Yeah.
But I also think that a life in the theater it's not a cult because we can leave it, but it's interesting the way in which it binds you.
Yes.
That your sense of self gets embedded in it, your sense of identity gets embedded in it. And so that's the other part of the grief, is to sort of mourn that self that didn't even exist, the projected self, and to just have to talk about being in the moment. You have to be in the moment with who you are, and it's tough if you've set that up in your head as being, I think, a different idea or a different outcome.
So you're teaching now, and
Yep.
you're teaching directing. And I had a conversation with Will Frears, who was in our class at Yale together. And he has started an organization called the Mercury Store, which really is almost like a theater collective that allows people to come in and, as he described it, for the director or the choreographer to create a rough draft of the play in 3D. Mm-hmm. And that it also allows the director to locate themselves within the project. And we've talked about how you also experienced that feeling that he experienced, that when you're directing, you're often brought into the process long after a lot of the decisions have been made, and you're sort of executing the Guthrie's sometimes idea of what King Lear or whatever is going to be, or we've already got this costume designer, this actor, go, and that no one ever turns to you in the process and says, well, what do you need to do this play? What do you as an artist need within this construct? And that led to him, that caused him a lot of concern as an artist, particularly as we develop. We have deeper needs sometimes than just to have our ego stroked. We want to have a meaning in the work that we're doing and find ourselves in that. And I was so surprised by that, because I was like, I've never thought about a director locating themselves in the work, which is absolutely short-sighted on my part and probably many people's parts. But I wonder how you are addressing that with the students that you're teaching today, that as directors, they still need to locate themselves within the work that they're doing.
I mean, I definitely felt in the 80s that I had a little bit of an opposite experience to Will, where I felt like there was a push to locate yourself in the work in a way that was articulatable and concept-based and would basically get you lots of attention and grants. The New York Times would like, basically. That's the distinction I would make. What came out of that is I remember having conversations post-grad school, but for a long time, about how unbelievably lonely directing was. Because when you're supposed to be basically the German Duke in the situation, you have so much status that you can't turn to somebody and say, I'm in trouble. Or I think I blew that. And one of the key things about diving into Yale, I remember I was sitting with Andy Casano and we were looking at a set, and Andy was stage managing. And Andy did what would happen all the time at Yale, but never, it was rarely one in the professional world, I find. He leaned over to me and said, Glynis, why is the bed so far downstage? And I looked at the stage Okay, so we need to prepare for this. And I was really one of my, I mean, you were talking about your memories. That was my absolute, I have to say I fell in love with Andy because I was a collaborator at that moment because it was so simple and he was right. He was so right. And I think that's, in terms of locating yourself in the work, I would phrase it slightly differently, which is, where is the humanity of everybody in the room, but also the people who are running the room? And I don't just think that's directors. I think it happens to stage management too. Stage management tends to show up before we show up, leave after we leave. I've been in room after room after room after room where I don't know that anybody goes over to the stage manager and says, what do you need? What can I do for you?
Right.
And I think that kind of permeated our whole profession. I don't, the actors were supposed to just show up and do what they were told. The director was supposed to be brilliant and magnanimous and, run the room perfectly at all times. So what that sets up is a kind of perfectionist system. Where nobody is allowed to make mistakes and everybody has to be perfect at all times, and nobody gets to be human, and nobody gets to have an identity or feelings or have a bad day. And I think that that goes to also work. Work is supposed to be perfect the first time it's released from the body. Like the first draft is always supposed to be perfect. And this is a myth that I find was in me, isn't every young person I've ever run into. They're like, why isn't it good? And I'm like, why would you think the first time you did anything it would be good? That's crazy. So what we do and what we're pretty committed to is this idea of a drafting process. So for example, if you want to do a show as an undergrad, and you're like, give me all the resources. And we say, well, have you done a version of it yet? Have you labbed it at all yet? Have you done any draft whatsoever? So it's interesting when you talk about directorial vision, because what I found was, I don't know that where I would agree with Will, I don't know that there was an understanding that vision actually goes through a drafting process. And so where is the place where I can throw out the terrible idea I have that I need to get out of my body so all the good ideas can come in? I would say in teaching too, it's what I find is, and it's interesting making the distinction between a first draft and a last draft. So if you're showing me a final project, I have different expectations of that final project. But the idea was there should have been a place where you could blow it. Because for me, so I don't think it's just directors. I think that it has to do with creativity culture. I don't think we teach creativity very well. I think we teach creativity as like Athena from the leg of Zeus, like it just blows into the world and look how brilliant that person is. But we always look at whatever somebody's done recently, and we don't think about all the like not so great musicals that they wrote. We don't talk about process. We're so worried about protecting our image that we don't talk about error and where those errors can be expected to be made. So that's sort of how that goes into my teaching. I'm very, when we're working, when a student brings, particularly in auditions, when a student brings me in a piece and I start giving them notes, I almost always say, the minute I gave you that note, I put my hand in your process and now I take responsibility for messing you up. So if you're terrible, it's great. And also I do a thing where I go, can you be terrible on purpose for me? That's an interesting one, because I've never seen anybody actually be terrible when I've asked them to be terrible on purpose.
You freed them the minute you said, be bad, because we all have these ideas that we have to be good and we have to say the word just so, and I did my homework and that needs to be present. You basically just free them.
Because it turns out that actually that's not where creativity and the notion of being good at something are not, they're mutually exclusive.
Totally.
A lot of times in the brain.
I mean, we even find Da Vinci sketches. He's like, oh, that didn't work.
Yeah. Do you know about this thing called the failure ratio?
No.
So I happened upon this idea of the failure ratio, and the failure ratio is, what is the ratio of failure in your process? And it cannot be zero. So how many successes to how many failures? And if it's 1-to-1, that's weird. That you expect for every 2 times you try, you will get it 50% of the time is actually very weird and kind of inappropriate. It turns out that actually a really good failure ratio, particularly for writers, this has been going around writer circles for a long time in terms of submissions, is more like 99-to-1. And that's successful. Okay, let's break it down. 70-to-1, which is pretty good. But that means that you have to expect that failure is a part of your process. And if you don't expect that, you're probably not in a very healthy or generative process. And the minute I sort of put that on the table, it blew my mind. And it's actually, it's an entrepreneurship theory. It has to do with startups and any process by which you're bringing something new into the world. So I would say that about Will's work. It's like, what we didn't have was realistic failure ratios. They talked about them, but not really, not in the sense of how many auditions do you expect to go to and not book.
Most.
Right. So 99 to 1.
You work with directors, you've taught acting. How are you able, and you were doing this when we were at school together, so I've worked with you firsthand and I know this about you and your work. You're able to pull stuff out of actors that probably surprise them and surprise the people who know the body of their work. And I'm wondering, I don't know how you do that. And I don't know if you even know how you do that. But I think that ability to pull something out of someone that they may not even realize is there, I think is really a spectacular gift, particularly for a person who's an educator now. How do you do that?
So there's a technique to it. And one of them is I see something happen, but the biggest part is I have to remove the idea that I'm right. So it always starts with, hey, I saw this. I'm interested in it. Let's investigate it. This is usually what goes through my head. I'm like, oh, wow, I'm watching a poll to the left. Okay, that seems like they're not interested in the right. What does the right represent? And then I'll get an idea. It'll just pop into my head. I'm like, oh, I think they don't like this idea. That maybe they're like judging the character, or maybe they don't like they don't like that word because I'm watching a whole body do this, just tiny, but I'm watching it. And so I might say something like, hey, it feels like maybe do you not like that word? But everything is always couched in terms of that nothing I say is necessarily correct. I'm always asking, because I'm just reading it.
And are you open to being wrong? Or is
Totally.
Okay.
So my major moments, my best moments with students were when I hit the student who I would try the thing that worked on, again, like 90% of the 5% of the students, and they were like, I don't get it. I remember one time I had to go home and I had to think about it because they needed me to say it a different way. And so I came back the next week and I said, let's try this. And it was, I was like, I'll do it with you. It's actually a vulnerability exercise, because one of the biggest things an actor, particularly an actor on film, needs is the ability to do vulnerability on command, which is weird and a lot like scuba diving or going to space. The body does not like it. So you have to be tethered. It's like space in the sense that, and a little like scuba diving in the sense that you have to be tethered to the ship, and we need to be able to get you back.
Right.
So a lot of my work in that way, I felt, was about seeing people and giving permission and being willing to be the guide for, I would be on the ship and I was like, go down that road, but I guarantee you, I will not let you do something that can't be in the show, because I'll tell you if you can't be in the show.
You won't be embarrassed.
Well, I can't control your embarrassment, but I can tell you that in my understanding as an artistic human and my understanding of the script, and I mean, I can sort of lay it out for you why I actually think that is the very direction that you want to go in, and
Right.
You might as well try.
I have one last question for you. We talk about on this show people who've said yes to the unexpected, made that leap of faith. What for you was that moment in your life when you had to make the leap of faith, say yes to the unexpected?
So it feels like the leaps of faith change. One of them, right, the one activating right now is what it is to be the parent of a budding teenager. I'm having to learn that my impulse to, I don't know, protect, step in is about my own fear. We're talking about ego. It's about my need. I need to raise a successful child. The parents' need to raise a successful child is compulsive, and it gets in the way a lot.
Right.
Because if you know, and I certainly went through this with my family, it means that failure, you're not only taking yourself down, you're taking your family down.
Right.
And that makes it just, the lift becomes that much greater. So it's hard to take those leaps that you're talking about if you feel like you're going to take everybody down. But the other one that occurs to me is that I've been walking into rooms in which conversations about race are happening pretty candidly, and not only race, but gender identity and sexuality. in ways that don't let me shortcut. I have to be fully present. And that's fine. This goes to teaching directing if I'm the authority in the room. But when I lose that protection, it can sometimes be very disconcerting and scary. And the things we haven't talked about is what happens when survival gets in the water. The minute survival starts to feel threatened, like the body completely flips out. And it flips out from an old record that doesn't have anything to do with our current social path. Like it's old tigers. And so it's interesting to have been in a place where, you know, you reach a certain amount of success in a certain amount of position and the students think your lessons are great. And you've been so joyful with me about the work that you experience with me. And then you have to, and it is voluntary, that's the crazy part. You have to put yourself in a room in which the good vibes are not necessarily part of the mix. And you might have to do some examination of your own behavior, things you didn't know you had to examine, things that you were a perpetrator in and didn't realize. Walking into those spaces, like I can feel my whole system go light up, is so deeply important and matters so much, and has been so valuable and worthwhile and shaken me up on a core level and scared the fuck out of me. But I feel like it's a change. Like I can feel how much it is needed. And so those two things, parenting a teenager and dealing directly with the issue of race in America, have been spaces where I leapt, I said yes, and it's still super scary, but it's really, I think it's everything we're supposed to do and be.
And I think we're going to continue to tread in those waters of what race and gender identity and socioeconomic class mean in America right now, because it's all on the table. And I think the people who have been traditionally left out of the equation in America have just said, take your foot off my neck. And we are really upsetting and restitching the social fabric right now. And it's uncomfortable for everybody, as it should be, you know, as we redraw and reimagine what it's going to look like as we move forward. So
yeah.
Glynis, thank you so much for your time today. I am so happy that you gave me an hour of your life on a Sunday in spring. I'm so grateful to you for your wisdom and your voice. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you for having me, Patrick. It's always a pleasure to be in your space, but I'm so glad I could be on this podcast. I think it's amazing.
I'm so
the
happy.
work you're doing and the sessions that you've had, and I'm just so excited and grateful to be a part of it.
Thank you. And to those of you who are watching or listening, remember, we all have a voice. Use yours wisely. Bye, everyone.